Welcome to Inframarginalism and Internet. I am Ramsey Woodcock, assistant professor at University of Kentucky Rosenberg College of Law. And I've got Mike Gutentag here, who's a professor at LMU of Loyola.
LMU Loyola Law School.
LMU Loyola Law School. I know that you've been going through a rebranding.
Yes.
And this is a sort of an introductory session before the formal start of the conference that's meant to provide a little bit of a primer on the idea of inframarginalism, which is sort of the binding idea for the entire conference program. So this is going to be, for those of you who are sophisticated economists, this may come off as sort of baby talk. But for those of you who are new to sort of economic perspectives on the law, and particularly to left-wing or progressive economic perspectives on the law, I'm hoping that this will be useful in understanding how you can pursue a progressive agenda and with attention to distribution of wealth through economics or through the economic lens, not by having to restructure what we have in economics, but rather simply through a slight change in perspective, a change in emphasis. The Tobin Project, if you go to the Tobin Project website, they have a sort of motto of Tobin's, which was the most important question that you face as a scholar is the choice of what to study, and that's very much true, I think, with respect to economics. If you're going to take an economic approach, if you approach it from the right perspective, you can do very powerful things from a progressive perspective. So what is inframarginalism? What's the idea behind this conference? It's basically, there's nothing new here. It's throughout the history of economics, there's been a debate over distribution versus efficiency. In order to expand the size of the pie, sometimes we might have to divide it up in ways that we don't like, and vice versa. In order to divide the pie up in ways that we like, we might have to reduce its size. It's this trade-off or potential trade-off between distribution and efficiency. And the argument here is that in recent decades, the focus of those doing economics has generally been upon the efficiency side of this equation. You study first the efficiency problems, and then as a sort of afterthought, you try to figure out what the welfare consequences are, and maybe you do it and put it in your paper, and maybe you don't get around to it and leave it for somebody else. The argument here is maybe we have that backwards, and maybe it's important to go back to the way we did law and economics a century ago during the first great law and economics movement. And that's a phrase I believe was coined by Herbert Hovenkamp, but certainly his article on the first great law and economics movement, and also Barbara Fried's great book, The Progressive Assault on Laissez-Faire, are great ways to become familiar with that. But what these economists did a century ago, the progressive economists, was they took the distribution question as being the most important one. That was their main focus. And while it's not that they didn't care about efficiency, what they were concerned with was distribution. And that's really just that slight change of focus is all that is meant by inframarginalism here in the conference title. But so what I'm going to do is provide a short sort of basic economic primer that really emphasizes the distributive aspect here. And then I'll turn it over to Mike, who has his own, who's really done some pioneering work in sort of resurfacing this distributive perspective in law and economics, and has his own take on how to approach it. So the basic characteristic of economics, the fundamental unit, if you will, is the idea of the transaction. The idea that one wants to move resources from lower valued uses to higher valued uses. So we want to promote this sort of free exchange. And what you get from that is surplus. It's the gains from trade. So you have somebody who has has a physical object that they place a certain value on. Somebody else places a higher value on it. If the object is transferred to the person who places a higher value on it, the pie has expanded. Right? If you think about think about life in terms of utility, right? The sort of total utility in the society is increased because somebody who had something they didn't really need now is giving it to someone who does need it and does value it and does want to do something with it. And so the way economics conceptualizes this sort of cost-benefit analysis approach is to say, well, you have somebody who, say places a $1 value on the good, and you've got somebody over here who places a $3 value on the good. And so if we can get the good to the $3 person, we, in some sense, create $2 of value. Right? When the good was with the person who placed $1 value on it, there was only $1 of value in society, so to speak. And now that it goes to the person who places the $3 value, we've got $2 more of value out there than we did before. The $3 value that the recipient places on it, less the $1 value that's lost by the person who's giving up the thing when we place the $1 value on it. So that margin, that difference between the $1 value and the $3 value, that's surplus. Right? That's the gain from trade. That's the value added of economics in exchange. The key insight, or the key aspect of the sort of inframarginalist perspective of the distribution of wealth perspective on economics is to observe that there's no constraint whatsoever regarding what the terms of trade are here, so long as they're between the $1 and the $3. If the person selling the good, who places a $1 value on it, sells it for $2, then they're going to capture $1 of the surplus for themselves, since they're giving up something that's worth $1 to them, but getting $2 in exchange. And the person who buys it at the $3 value, they're going to get $1 of that surplus as well, since they place a $3 value on the good, but they're paying $2 for it. So price divides the gains from trade, distributes the gains from trade between the buyer and the seller. The price that we choose between the $1 and the $3 is not determined by economics. Efficiency doesn't tell us anything about what that price should be, because all that efficiency requires is that the trade take place. That's how you increase the pie. That's how you move the good from the lower value use to higher value use. But how those gains from trade are divided up has no bearing on whether that transaction takes place, so long as the price charge falls within the minimum that the seller is willing to sell for and the maximum that the buyer is willing to buy for. So long as we're within the realm of surplus here and the price that we choose, we have complete freedom to distribute wealth. Approached from this perspective, right? This is the way economics were taught to you in Econ 101. I think the experience of constraint that many progressives have when they encounter economics would be much reduced, because what it's doing is it's actually, the heart of it is in fact this sort of non-economically determined question of how to distribute the surplus between buyer and seller. So economics, from this perspective, often seems to be, sort of efficiency-oriented economics often seems to be constantly struggling to find ways to undermine this basic space of freedom that we have between cost and willingness to pay, so to speak, between the $1 and the $3. And probably the most familiar way, the one that you encounter first in Econ 101, is the classic Marshallian scissors. the supply and demand. So instead of starting with what I just did, with a single transaction, a single unit, buyer and a seller negotiating a price, what economics usually starts with is something that's actually much more complicated and also relies on much more restrictive assumptions. It's a peculiar, complicated edifice. And that is what you start with in economics usually is this. It's your supply curve and your demand curve. And the argument here is we don't just take an individual transaction as our basic unit to start with. Instead, we start with a lot of buyers and a lot of sellers. And all the buyers have different willingnesses to pay. And so we line them up with those with the highest willingness to pay. We put them at the beginning, and then those with lower willingnesses to pay, we put them later on. And the same thing with sellers. And then we say that price is uniform. Then we posit that price has to be uniform. And I'll get into in a second why we do that. But we posit that price has to be uniform across all buyers and sellers. And once you make that assumption, now you find constraint where you didn't before. Now the gains from trade have to be divided up in a particular way in order for efficiency to be done. The answer is the price has to be the price that equilibrates supply and demand. If this price has to be uniform, and our goal is to make sure that all transactions for which the buyer is willing to pay more than the seller, the minimum that the seller is willing to accept, have to be done, which is what you need for efficiency. We want all resources to move from lower valued uses to higher valued uses. If that's our goal, and we're constrained by this uniform price, now we're in a situation in which the price has to be the same across all buyers and sellers. And so this transaction between the $1 seller and the $3 buyer, now there's a determinate specific distribution of the gains from trade that has to be accomplished. So if this was, for example, a $2 price, now we can no longer say there's complete freedom in how we divide the gains from trade between this $1 seller and the $3 buyer. Now we have to say, no, they can only be divided in this way such that each gets $1 from the transaction. And so we have the experience of constraint being brought into the distributive question. Now, if you're an efficiency-oriented person, if you're a marginalist, so to speak, and where the marginalism comes from is precisely here, right? The idea that, well, if you've got this uniform price and you want all efficient transactions to take place, then you're constrained to charge the price that just brings together, just allows the seller with the highest minimum that they're willing to sell at and the buyer with the lowest willingness to pay together. And so you're constrained in order to make this transaction, efficient transaction, take place, you're constrained throughout all the other units. These are the inframarginal units here. So if you're an efficiency-oriented person, you're fine with this picture. You stop here, right? You've managed to fully resolve the economic problem, including the distributive problem, in efficiency terms, and you can go home. But if you're an inframarginalist, if what you're interested in is the distribution of wealth, you're not going to stop there. You're going to ask tough questions about whether this picture actually makes sense. Whether we really do live in a world in which, for example, all prices are constrained uniform. And as soon as you do that, you start to realize that, of course, that's not true. Of course, that's not true. Only in highly structured markets, regulated markets, do you have a situation in which all buyers and sellers are sort of anonymous. There's large numbers of them. They know nothing about each other. They don't know. They can't negotiate with each other because they don't have any idea what the maximum of any particular buyer is that they're willing to pay, or what the minimum of any particular seller is that they're willing to sell at. And so you just have to choose, you just have to go with a price that regardless of who comes to sell to you, you know you're going to be able to do a transaction. That world of perfect competition, that world of anonymous buyers and sellers, that exists only in these sort of highly liquid commodities exchanges. There's a famous case in antitrust, the Chicago Board of Trade case, in which Justice Brandeis, rules upon these rules in the Chicago Board of Trade that says members can't trade outside of trading hours. They can only trade on the exchange. And why does Justice Brandeis say that this is a good rule? He says it's because it prevents market transactions from taking place on the side at prices other than the market price. So only in these sort of highly artificial trading environments, highly structured trading environments, do we actually have these constrained uniform prices. And in fact, when you go out into the world, you've got buyers and sellers who are meeting and negotiating prices on their own all the time. And this, just pushing back on this idea that this notion that the uniform price is a worthwhile assumption, has, for me at least, led to a very fruitful look at the consequences of technology for uniform pricing. Right? Within the information age, with copious data out there and the ability of firms to vary prices all the time and to know their customers, we're approaching a world in which firms can isolate out transactions. They can isolate out the $3 buyer, and they know exactly what their cost is, what their unit cost is when they sell to that buyer. And so they can pick prices now that are within, that divide up the gains from trade any way in which they want, unconstrained by that uniform market price that may have once existed in the past. And so if we're in a world in which now price can actually vary on each unit, in which we have personalized pricing, what does that mean for this entire economic paradigm, this Marshallian scissors with the uniform price constraining how we distribute wealth over the inframarginal units? What does it mean? It means it's gone. And it means that in markets of the future, we're going to have the ability to think on a unit by unit basis about who should get those gains from trade. This isn't the only way in which, so the Marshallian scissors, the supply and demand, isn't the only way in which economics is tried to sort of find constraint with respect to the distributive question. There's another way that I encountered when I was first getting into antitrust, and is also quite common in the intellectual property context, and that is this concept of appropriability. The concept of appropriability. The idea here is that in order for firms to produce the most innovative products, the best products for us, they need to have they need to be rewarded accurately for the benefits that they confer on society. So if we go back to our $1 seller and $3 buyer, the idea here is that in order to get that $1 seller to produce whatever it is that they're willing to sell for a minimum of $1, they need to be able to appropriate the entire surplus, because that gives them an accurate measure of the value that they're conferring, and that allows them to plan how much they should spend in order to produce that good. So, so the price they need to be able to charge is the $3. They need to extract all of the surplus. This is the appropriability argument. Now, if you're efficiency inclined, yeah, it kind of makes sense, right? How do you have the right incentive to confer benefits on society? You need to internalize all those benefits. Take them for yourself, and then if you're a self-interested, profit-maximizing person, you're gonna maximize those benefits. But if you're distributively inclined, you realize immediately that this is an absolutely absurd proposition, and it's for two reasons. First, think about first, there's a category mistake involved. So what is the minimum that somebody is willing to sell a product for? Well, that's got to be the minimum amount that makes them ready, willing, and able to produce the item and transfer it. Well, if we want to make the argument that they have to appropriate all of the benefits that they confer in order for them to be able to be ready, willing, and able to produce the product, the best possible product, then we're actually not talking about appropriation of surplus at all anymore. Instead, we're recategorizing all of the surplus, all of the gains from trade as being costs, of production. And costs are the payments that are necessary to make a producer ready, willing, and able to produce. If they need to get the entire surplus to produce, then that's a cost of production. But then what does that mean? That means that we've assumed away the problem. That means that there are no gains from trade. There are no gains from trade at all, because in order to have efficient production, you've got to have all of those gains go to one party. And that's just absurd, right? It goes against certainly this foundational idea in economics that economics is all about expanding the pie. It's all about moving resources from lower valued uses to higher valued uses. You're not doing that if the minimum that you're willing to accept in order to produce is full surplus. You're not actually moving resources from lower valued use to higher valued use, because the fact that you require that payment means you've got some alternative out there that's just as good that you would go to if you didn't get that payment, which means that the resource isn't actually being moved to higher valued use in your producing it. But it's also absurd from a distributive perspective, because it implies that even if there were gains from trade, even if we didn't have this category mistake, buyers would enjoy none of them, and producers would get all of them. So from an economic perspective, if you pay a price equal to the value that you place on a good in order to get access to it, you are no better off than if you didn't have the good at all. So what's the point of production and innovation and intellectual property if the price we pay for it leaves us indifferent to having it or not having it at all? And that is the logical ending of these appropriability arguments. I'll touch on just one more way in which sort of efficiency-oriented economists are constantly trying, in my view, unsuccessfully, to sort of tame this lawless space between the reservation prices of trading parties. And that is, in the realm of game theory and cooperative game theory in particular, what economists consider are negotiations usually between what they call bilateral monopoly negotiations between a buyer and a seller, neither of which is constrained by some sort of broader demand or supply curve. So they're negotiating one-on-one. And so cooperative game theorists should know better than anyone that there is this realm of complete freedom that we have to divide up the gains from trade, because they're considering just this one-on-one transaction very often. And yet even here, when they're efficiency oriented, you find them struggling to actually create a determinate division of the surplus. And so, for example, there's this artificial construct of the Nash bargaining solution. And it's basically a sort of clever way of, if you make certain assumptions, arguing that there's a determinate price to which a buyer and a seller are going to bargain in these kinds of environments. But it's all artificial. It's all based on artificial assumptions. Same thing, you have shapely value. You see this desire to sort of tame this space. And that makes sense from an institutional perspective. And that's what economists do, is they try to find constraint and clarify what constraint is. But if you're a distribution-minded lawyer economist, you have to hold on to the fact, you have to do the intellectual work necessary to maintain the freedom that you find here, the extraordinary freedom you find here in the interstices of the sort of rational framework that neoclassical economics provides. Now, we can argue about it. Certainly a lot of work has been done to undermine the basic cost-benefit analysis assumption. So a lot of work has been done to say, hey, look, what this minimum the seller is willing to pay to accept is, and what the maximum the buyer is willing to accept is. These are determined by society. These are determined by pre-existing property rights, because they're determined ultimately by alternatives, right? The minimum you're willing to accept for your good depends on what other alternatives you have for selling it or for spending your time. And that's a complex social function of property rights and norms and luck and what have you. So one can accept that the entire sort of neoclassical economic paradigm might have unstable foundations. But the point here is, you don't have to do that in order to find an extraordinary expansive freedom for progressive action within the system itself, And in engaging with the system in this way, it also makes it possible to bring into the conversation much more diverse group of intellectual orientations than one would normally get by simply rejecting economics in toto. And indeed, one of my goals in organizing this conference has been to say, look, we can do left-wing law and economics. We don't have to throw economics out in order to pursue a progressive agenda, which is something that certain strands of progressive business law seem to have been pursuing in recent years. So with that, I will turn the conversation over to Mike, who has a somewhat different approach to these topics. But
not that different. Ramsey, that was really wonderful. I rarely say this as a scholar, but I agreed with everything you said. So thank you. And given the stage, the first thing I want to do is thank you, Ramsey, for what must have been a Herculean effort to bring so many scholars together. I know usually when I present my ideas, people laugh at me or think I missed the introductory economics class. So it's really wonderful to be in a community that is trying to advance these ideas. So thank you, Ramsey. I think what I can add, what I'm going to do, since Ramsey's generously given me the opportunity, is to share with you what I see when I look through the inframarginalist lens, and a little bit from a historical perspective. So I am going to use PowerPoint. Let's see if this works. I'm not a veteran of hop, skip, and jump, or whatever this is called. Let me do this. Okay. So Ramsey, you'll let me know if you can't see this. So
we're seeing you great.
Okay. As with Ramsey, I really start with a supply and demand curve, because now when I look at that, all I see is the surplus. All I see is, oh my gosh, and this huge area. When I was taking introductory economics, sure, we talked about consumer surplus and producer surplus, but it's about the third or fourth week in. And now I look and I say, oh my gosh, that's wealth. That's untapped wealth. And I don't think it's just an artifact of the diagram. I think there's something real here. And that is the opportunity. And this is not, the first thing I want to say is, and I'm gonna have basically two core ideas about the opportunity and constraints that come when you recognize this surplus. And neither of them are new ideas. These are very old ideas. And what's interesting and what I'm going to try and track is how such basic old ideas could have been lost, particularly among legal scholars who are studying economics. So anyway, the first idea about surplus is the opportunity, and that's what Ramsey was talking about. Surplus creates opportunity. And as I say, not a new idea. This is probably one of the oldest ideas in economics. And David Ricardo, sorry, I have a 8 o'clock alarm on West Coast time. One of the oldest ideas, it comes from David Ricardo, who both was sort of a founder of the marginalist school, but realized as soon as you realized that there was a margin, there was also going to be some resources that were inframarginal. And I love this line from David Ricardo. He talks about the fact that if these resources are inframarginal, then you can move them around. And you can, in his treatise, he says you could enable some farmers to live like gentlemen. So Ricardo recognized there was a redistributive opportunity that arose from the existence of inframarginal resources. And people noticed. This is not an idea that went unnoticed. I mean, this was, if you, I've got a various items, various ways in which this idea was noticed and resonated, particularly in the late 1800s. So let me explain what some of these call outs are. At the very bottom right, that's the Principles of Political Economy by Francis Bowen is the first economics textbook they used at Harvard. And there was one chart in it, one graph. And what was it a graph of? It was a graph of Ricardo's idea about this inframarginal resource. And then you may or may not know Progress and Poverty, which again, I think was really inspired by Ricardo's insight. And it was at the time the best-selling book, and a lot of consequences. One was the Fabians in the UK were inspired. As Ramsey mentioned, this inspired to some degree a major movement among legal scholars to figure out the opportunities that were presented by the inframarginal. And I personally believe that Woody Guthrie and the idea of sharing land is the birth of that, is the idea, it arises from this inframarginal insight. We have surplus resources that we can share. So when J-Lo started singing "This Land Is Your Land" at the Biden inauguration, I started to cry. Okay, that's true. Okay, anyway, so that's the insight, that's the opportunity. There's another, what I view as a second core idea about surplus that Ramsey didn't mention, that I think should be forefront and actually ties into efficiency considerations. And the second major idea from my perspective about this surplus is that it's constantly at risk. It has the possibility of consuming itself. Surplus, I love to say, surplus invites wasteful competition. If we start fighting to control surplus, all we are doing is wasting resources. Again, not a new idea. Let me read a quote from Gordon Tullock. Expenditures which may simply offset each other to some extent are purely wasteful from the standpoint of society as a whole. They are spent not on increasing wealth, but in attempts to transfer or resist transfer of wealth. So surplus is an opportunity because it's unfound wealth, untapped wealth, but it's also a risk because it invites competition. And unlike competition that might help us in some circumstances to get to efficient marginal pricing, competition for inframarginal resources does nothing but generate waste. Okay, so those are my two core insights, and they're old insights. So what happened to them? Why, when I took introductory economics or when I went to law school, why weren't these ideas at the forefront of what we were studying? And I have on this slide, and in a paper I published in Utah, I talk about 3 missed opportunities. The first missed opportunity I blame on those same rent-seeking scholars. if the idea is that surplus can invite waste, and you put that together with the idea that between the supply and demand curve, there's an incredible amount of inframarginal resources, we kind of have a huge problem. We have a potential of a massive amount of economic waste, but the rent-seeking scholars never went there. They said, oh, the only time competition for surplus is a problem is when you're competing for government resources to maintain a monopoly. Why didn't they go to the larger problem? Seems to me it was completely political. These folks were pretty darn conservative, and they just accepted the idea that in markets, things work well. So don't mess with markets. We're not going to see any waste in markets. Markets are not to be touched. Our problem does not exist there. Well, I think they're just wrong. Okay. The second group of scholars that you would think would naturally be engaged in the kind of work that Ramsey and I, and hopefully many of you who are at this conference are engaged in, you'd think that this would be law and economics scholarship. And as Professor Hovenkamp identified, it used to be law and economics scholarship. So what happened? So one thing I want to say is I don't blame Richard Posner, because I think he, if you read his scholarship, he was cognizant of this waste problem. He has a wonderful discussion of the law of salvage. And it's very interesting what the problem is that he identifies and how he solves the problem. So the problem is the surplus, you know, the finding, the rescuing. In that case, the surplus comes not from the gap between willingness to pay and cost to produce. The surplus comes from, you know, a treasure. His suggestion is, well, surplus will invite wasteful competition. And his solution is to limit property rights. If you restrict the reward, then you won't have this rush to this wasteful competition. But other folks, I think, are not as aware of this problem. So, and I don't blame Ronald Coase, but I think it was natural from Coase's insights about law's irrelevance in certain circumstances to think that laws simply couldn't do anything about this surplus problem or this existence, this occurrence of what happens within the inframarginal range. I think all of us, the second point I would say is Kaplow and Chevel's work, their double distortion argument. I think all of us who work in this space are constantly grappling with the claims of Lewis Kaplow and Steve Chevel. Their claim is that if you want to focus on redistribution, you need to use the tax system, because that is always going to be the better approach. And we each have our different ways of grappling with it. Let me just say in a nutshell, my way of grappling with that argument is to say that they under-conceptualize what law can do. So for instance, I am going to propose, and maybe I won't have time to, but if I do, I'll talk about some of the specific ways law can address the surplus problem, that law can redistribute resources and avoid wasteful competition. That's a concept of a problem that law can solve that doesn't fit in their model. But that certainly has, the elegance of their model has certainly pushed back against scholars who are trying to develop ideas in this area. And then there's always been the libertarian view that, going back to Ramsey's discussion of the gap between the $1 and the $3, a libertarian might say, we shouldn't get involved. Let these parties fight that fight for themselves. Well, I would say that's inefficient, and it doesn't go along with my conception of what it means to pursue the social good. But these are ideas that have constrained the area. And then just a third point, you would think that consumer law folks would be the people who really care about this. But people like Oren Bar-Gil have been focused on this narrow efficiency question. They've sort of been brought into this view. Anyway, that's where we stop. Let me check in with you, Ramsey.
Yeah, Mike. So this is really fascinating, and what you say about consumer law, I think in particular, it's quite surprising. The sort of resistance you find, I think, among consumer law scholars to sort of the economic enterprise generally, where a lot of the motivation that seems to drive consumer law cases is really about distribution. I mean, you think about what's going on in Williams against Walker Thomas Furniture Company or something. And it's all about, it's clear that this buyer of furniture is going to be impoverished essentially by the price terms that have been imposed upon them. So you have these sort of, it's a field that's entirely distributively motivated, and yet has not really seemed to want to take up these rich tools, dating from the first law in economics movement that they could really use to make, I think, their case very effectively. But I'm actually curious. One of the nice things about taking a kind of inframarginalist approach, thinking about law and economics problems from a distributive perspective, is you get these sort of insights into markets and legal problems that you didn't have before. And are there any sort of applications or areas of the law in which you felt that the distributive perspective has kind of opened the door into understanding? I can tell you what brought me into this body of research was actually my work on insider trading. So, because it struck me as odd that people didn't want to think about who the winners were and who the losers were when insider trading occurs. And they all told, my colleagues would tell me, that doesn't matter. We want to have an efficient regime, and who the winners are and losers are doesn't matter when it comes to figuring out efficiency. If you want to talk about winners and losers, you have to go talk to our friends who do tax policy, and you have to understand optimal tax theory and do a lot of complicated math. In the meantime, that doesn't matter. But I now am convinced that the oversight has been on their part. Do you mind if I talk for a moment about insider trading law? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So let me tell you, insider trading law, which is, was an area of sort of conservative insight in the 60s. Henry Manny wrote a, very important book that basically said, wait a minute, why are we outlawing insider trading? He basically challenged the idea, people think it's unfair. Why are we talking about fairness? We're law and economics folks. We just talk about efficiency. And so the argument has been fought for the last 50 years on strictly efficiency grounds. And it's basically boiled down to this, which is, on the one hand, it's efficient to allow there to be insider trading because share prices are more accurate. Insiders, it's a way for insiders to communicate information about the firm without revealing that information. On the other hand, an alternative efficiency consideration is that people don't want to invest when other people have more information than them. They think, for some naive reason, according to this approach, that it's unfair. And so that's where insider trading scholarship has been. A very narrow efficiency question. Should we get more accurate share prices, or should we discourage, or how does that trade against, how does that balance against scaring people from the market?
And so your argument there is, it's not that you reject the idea that there are efficiency consequences for insider trading, but that you view the sort of loss, the deadweight loss there of limiting it as being small relative to the sort of distributive justice that's done.
Actually, That's a good, I haven't told you my punchline, but actually, when it comes to insider trading, as I said, there are these two issues that I think about at surplus, which is opportunity and waste. And actually, on the insider trading problem, I think it's the waste problem. I'm not as worried. I've become less worried about the distributive justice because it's rich people who work at companies and get the inside information. It's rich people who own shares of companies. So it's unclear. But what I've decided is it's the waste problem. Because inside information is the quintessential inframarginal property. It costs very little to produce. The value is very high. The cost to produce is very low. And the value of that information largely comes from the fact that you displace someone else. You move into the front of the line. It's like being in a movie theater line, and it's a fight to be first in line. You're not going to change how many people get into the movie theater.
I love the way that you've characterized that, because I've been thinking a lot about what the information age does for the sort of well-known problem of queuing. Right. So, we all learn about, how there's this horrible, Soviet world, decades ago in which everybody had to line up to get stuff. And, if only there had been a price system, then things sort of moved more efficiently. And I think that's basically right. I mean, if you ration with price, it is easier to sort of determine who gets stuff if you ration with price than through lining up. There's, you have to wait online, it's wasteful, it takes forever, there's lots of uncertainty. The distributive consequences might not be what you want, because when you ration with price, the people who have the most money are the ones who are going to get the goods, but it is more efficient, or it was at least. But now, in the information age, in the internet age, what is the cost of waiting online? I mean, we've done it in the pandemic. We've all done it in the pandemic. It means logging in to the website and having them say there's no available delivery dates, or logging into the website and it says sold out. How much time does that take? Nothing.
Yeah.
So the cost of queuing is greatly reduced today. And so there's a case to be made that the information age has also, in some senses, is putting, non-price forms of distribution on the same efficiency par with price, with what you used to have before with price. Now I guess that doesn't speak directly to what you're saying, but the part of thinking about this is recognizing that people often argue that markets, that queuing also doesn't work because people will just buy themselves to the head of the line, right? Queuing doesn't work because people buy themselves to the head of the line. Well, what you're saying is that the price system doesn't work because people buy themselves to the head of the wealth. If that makes
and they
right?
fight, they spend resources to get
right.
to the line. I mean,
so we've got these two, the queuing system and the price system,
and
both
I want to
into each other.
I want to say, so I think a lot about the queuing system. One, because if we're fighting for our place in line, that's a waste of resources. But also, I think that the type of good, and this makes me think, I want to say of Michael Sandel's work on spheres of justice. We know that there are certain goods that we don't want to allocate by means of a market. And sometimes when I go to law and economics conferences, I have a hard time convincing my colleagues that there's some goods where a queue or some kind of other ordering is more efficient. One, because you don't have the fight, and two, because there's some goods we obviously don't allocate based on price, right? I mean, if we have like 5 bottles of water in the desert, we don't let the rich person buy all 5 bottles because they're a little thirsty. right? So, I mean, so I don't know how that relates to your thoughts about queuing, but I just, these are alternative allocation systems, and the market is not always the most efficient, obviously. So anyway, I don't know.
No, I would agree with that. Well, we've got some interesting questions in the chat, and we've got 10 minutes. So let's take a look at the questions in the chat. So we have one from Dan Greenwood pointing out that the inframarginal cost of inside information isn't low at all. To be sure, it is absolutely correct that effort to be first to trade is pure waste. That's the problem. Once managers realize that this is a large part of their potential returns, they have a powerful incentive to produce inside information. I
agree and disagree. I'm not sure I understand why it's not inframarginal at all. I guess I would say it's inframarginal in that the value of the information comes at the expense of others, and so it's a transfer of value from one to another, and that's why I think of it as inframarginal. I don't know if that's responsive, but yes, the problem. I'm glad he agrees with me that the problem is the creation of waste. So I'll take a half yes and a half disagree.
Okay, great. And so now I'll move on to Stephen Calkins has a great question. He says his neighbors have been looking for vaccines. It's incredibly wasteful. So I would contend that is because we haven't fully harnessed the power of the internet to structure that vaccine rationing system. So the fact that they're spending time looking for vaccines is that you've got lots of different websites, right? It's not been centralized, but we can imagine a totally feasible alternative reality in which there were just one vaccine rationing website and all you had to do was get online and you were done. It's not too hard to imagine such a website being programmed. So my point is we may not be there in fact structurally, but it's in the feasible realm now for us to eliminate almost all queuing costs. The fact that you might have to the fact that some people will have to wait for vaccines, keep in mind, that's not a problem with queuing, because when you ration with price, some people get and some people don't also, right? So, that's not a cost in itself of queuing. So let's go now to Frank's question. What about, and so Duncan has helpfully provided a link to a CLS refutation of Kaplan Chabel. I haven't followed the link, but I think I know which one he has put there.
We all are fighting that battle.
Frank says, what about search costs? Doesn't reducing price to its marginal cost reduce costly search activity? Shouldn't these costs be factored into any welfare benefit of distributing the surplus? And the answer is yes, absolutely they should be. The only point I have to make about that is it's important to keep in mind that when we're talking about costs, we're not talking about surplus. So that may seem like a very slippery argument, that whenever you come back to me with an argument that, oh, haven't you forgotten about this cost? I just say, well, I'm happy to include that cost, but remember, cost is not surplus. That may seem very slippery, but at the end of the day, that's got to be right. It's got to be right. There's got to be gains from trade that can be distributed with freedom. And all I'm talking about are those. Those are all that I'm talking about. But if you try to tell me they don't exist, I will fight you on it.
I might add, yeah, price has been, in some markets, price is a nice, efficient way to slice up the surplus. I totally accept that. But I think if you look at what's happening, firms are spending so much money on price discrimination, right? Which is exactly the opposite, right? It's this effort to capture the surplus. So, what we're seeing is a move away in the competitive environment, a move away from using price as a clean mechanism to split surplus. And we see firms working to capture surplus. So that, that's the problem. It's, maybe the world where marginal price, where price just efficiently swipes surplus everywhere, maybe that's not that bad a world, but that's the world we're moving away from. That's not a world we're moving toward.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that.
I think you would certainly agree, right, Ramsey? That's your point.
Well, why don't we talk? So it looks like we've gotten to the end of the questions, but why don't we talk a little bit more about applications? So I thought I would outline a couple of one in particular, which I think is relevant to the sort of internet side of the inframarginalism and internet idea. Okay. And that is, what can just a focus on surpluses, and I should mention that for those who are new to this, rents, the term rents is often used to substitute for surpluses, and the idea here goes back to Ricardo, who first developed this idea in terms of the rent of land. But we can think of the internet, what the internet has done with the tech giants and the crisis in newspapers, as in some sense being all about the shifting of rents, the shifting of surpluses from one industry to another. And we can think of it also as posing the question about how surpluses are spent. So there's the economic problem of can we conceptually turn surpluses into costs and sort of eliminate the distributive problem. But there's a separate question, which is, if we accept that we have surpluses, it doesn't mean that they just disappear into thin air. People who are given them can spend them, and sometimes they spend them in socially useful ways, and sometimes they spend them in less socially useful ways. And so part of what we should consider in taking an inframarginal perspective is not just trying to eliminate or prevent certain groups from taking surpluses, but asking which groups are likely to use them in a way that we feel is most socially productive. And so in the internet context, you might make an argument that what we've seen with the rise of the tech giants is a redistribution of the massive surpluses that are generated through the sale of advertising, which were once captured by the newspaper industry, which was famously one of the most dominant enduring monopoly industries of the 20th century. Every city had one paper and was just racking up its monopoly rents in the sale of local advertising. We now have that. That was those monopolies, those geographically dispersed monopolies were centralized by the tech giants, which took over the advertising function. They had a better way of advertising. They can supply advertising more effectively. And so business flowed to them, and now they get those rents. They get the rents generated from the advertising business. Instead of having it be multiple papers, it's just one or two big firms that get them. And the crisis in news that's resulted from that is primarily one of how the monopoly profits are spent. So the old newspapers would spend them in part on investigative reporting, which they didn't need to spend them on. They could have still gotten the circulation they wanted by running tabloid headlines. But Google and Facebook don't have that tradition of spending those rents that way. And it's interesting. It's been interesting to watch the way in which that's shifted over time, and how, through public pushback and pushback also from the news industry, just the other day, Google and Facebook, were announcing that they're now, going to start paying newspapers, for content. And that seems to be in part about, reallocating these rents, to those who are perhaps more likely to spend them in a socially useful fashion. So it looks like we're just about out of time. Sorry, there's some other questions that have appeared here. Chris Isaac says, is data going to mitigate Hayek's claim on the limits of expertise to properly allocate goods more efficiently than price? I'm glad to see that Zemek is in the chat here, because his paper is all about that. So I'll let that question be answered that way. Gregoire says, what about the cost of waiting 30 minutes or more for the after-sales service to answer? Usually already costly per minute cost. Time patience here is the discriminant that eventually splits surplus, isn't it? Mike, any thoughts about that?
I have a paper on that. Come back come back. I know we're at it. I'll be presenting something on that in the last session of the symposium.
Okay, great. Well, so we're out of time, but so thank you. Thanks to all of you for joining us for this sort of introductory session, and we're very much looking forward to interacting
Thank you,
with you
Ramsey,
throughout the conference. And thank you, Mike, as well.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.